So the current situation with these RNA or DNA viruses is totally different. There's no organism or fragment of an organism in this vaccine at all. What there is a piece of genetic material. So I looked closely at one of these technologies that came out of Southern California. I can't remember the company's name, but what they used is a circular piece of DNA known as a plasmid, and those are naturally found in bacteria cells. And they put in some genes, genes from this genetic material that I told you about before that has an unknown origin. And what they're going to do is inject it into you, but not in a typical way where there's just a syringe with one needle. They have to use a special syringe with 3 needles. And the middle needle injects this DNA plasmid material and whatever else we don't know, it hasn't been disclosed yet. And then the outer 2 needles are electrodes, a positive and a negative electrode, and they basically create an electric current in your muscle, so under the skin. And what that does is it's for the purpose of something called electroporation. And the electric current makes little holes open up in the cells, in your muscle, and allows the DNA, the circular DNA plasmids, to get inside the cells. And so this is a technique they've used in laboratory experiments to learn things about different organisms, right? They've tried to use gene therapy this way. Like, let's say you have a genetic illness like cystic fibrosis, and they would try to transfect the gene that doesn't confer disease into your lungs, for example, and they've not been successful with it. But somehow they think they're going to be successful with this. But the idea is to get that genetic material into your cells, and then your cells make the so-called viral proteins. And those are antigenic, so they stimulate your immune system to create immunity to that. So I don't really see how this is going to be effective, because one thing is it's your own cells now making these foreign proteins. So if your immune system recognizes those as foreign, isn't it going to recognize your own cells as being foreign? So that's one problem with the theory. And then the other thing is we don't really know what is going to be on this DNA. Since we know that the origin of the RNA that they say is from a virus is from an unknown origin. So what are the genes they're going to be putting in here? And what is the purpose? So are they putting genes in there that would confer some kind of new function for our cells? Like, could it be toxic to us? Like, it's pure speculation. I don't know. But this is really gene therapy. It's not vaccine technology.
Yeah, this is genetic manipulation. I mean, the idea of this is just horrifying to me. So we're talking about something that they aren't even sure about exactly what it is, that they're using to make something they've never tested on people, that they're going to force out in a rushed amount of time because something we don't understand. That's just fantastic.
Right. And their goal is to have every single person on the planet accept this vaccine, right? That's been stated openly by people like Bill Gates and many others.
Who's behind all of this? Who's funding it? The connections that are there, because I'm sure that people would find that interesting.
Right. So I think it's I think we've been talking about a lot of the technologies in the past and in its state right now, but the whole relevance of this stuff has to do with the push for this RNA and DNA vaccines, right? And the people, it's not just the technology itself, it's the fact that the people producing these vaccines right now are companies backed by DARPA, and their platforms were developed by DARPA. And there's a lot of shady stuff here with this particular class of vaccines. So today, when someone tries to voice criticism about a potential coronavirus vaccine, it becomes, this whole, oh, you're an anti-vaxxer thing. Well, this is totally separate from that, I would argue, because this is about the fact that RNA and DNA vaccines are a new experimental type of vaccine. Yes, they have existed for a couple decades, but they have never in the United States ever been approved for human use, ever. And also notable in the realm of general vaccines, vaccine for coronavirus, any type of coronavirus, including when they tried to develop a vaccine for SARS, it did not work. They were not able to develop one for SARS. There were 2 for SARS that passed phase 1 trials, and it ended up creating permanent damage to the immune system in subsequent studies when they followed up, and that's why they were never approved. So the fact that there's this race for a coronavirus vaccine and these safety concerns, whether it's with a DNA vaccine or a regular vaccine for coronavirus, I mean, the fact that this is not getting talked about enough is very disconcerting, I think, on a lot of levels. And the fact that these RNA and DNA vaccines, which are the leading candidates, not just because they're being promoted by Bill Gates as a leading candidate, but because they're among the farthest along in trials. Both the DNA vaccine by Inovio Pharmaceuticals and the RNA vaccine by Moderna, both strategic allies of DARPA, they've already started human trials. They were okayed to skip animal testing. And this is really dangerous because previously DNA and RNA vaccines, because they're experimental and because of existing government regulations, their approval time was like over a decade. So now we're reducing that to a matter of months. And it involves the injection of these synthetically created, genetic material, in the case, RNA or DNA. And like I said, a lot of this genetic engineering stuff that DARPA's been researching for decades has involved those same synthetic chromosomes, right? Whether it's shortening someone's life or making them unable to have offspring, or, even the positive uses. It all uses these same synthetic chromosomes. And it's and this is the same technology being used here, but there's going to be no long-term health studies on it. So and there's also the potential with DNA vaccines specifically of having that genetic material incorporated into your cells forever. They say that the RNA ones will degrade over time, and so it's there isn't as much risk of that. We'll see whether the DNA or the RNA vaccine is the one they end up pushing out. But one thing that hasn't been talked about in relation to this vaccine is that one of the reasons it's never been approved for human use before is that even when they did get to human trials, they didn't work because they didn't generate enough immune response. They weren't able to get an antibody count high enough that showed that the immunity had been given by the vaccine. So they were, even on that level, considered ineffective. And so after that became revealed, the main fix promoted for that is to combine this with nanotechnology, right? And of course, these same, the synthetic DNA stuff and their use in vaccines, all of that dominated by DARPA, the nanotechnology stuff for medical purposes, also DARPA, and now we're seeing them both combined into these vaccines. So it's nanotechnology with RNA, or nanotechnology with DNA, and that nanotechnology is supposed to facilitate the entrance of that genetic material into these cells, right? So a lot of that hasn't been talked about at all. And also the fact, a lot of these companies, as I said earlier, they're strategic allies of DARPA. They've gotten millions of dollars in DARPA funding. They've also, in Moderna's case, directly collaborated on these vaccines together with DARPA, even after developing their platforms with DARPA. That hasn't been talked enough about. So what if DARPA wanted to introduce something into the human population? They would do it through a strategic ally that isn't necessarily DARPA, right? But also DARPA right now, they're not just pushing these long-term solution vaccines. They're also creating synthetic antibody treatments, which are basically these, made in a, synthetic genetic material that is injected into your body and has you produce the antibodies to coronavirus that is supposed to last for a couple of months before the longer term vaccine will be made available. So this is DARPA's, they call it a temporary vaccine that they're developing now and is going to be ready for use in probably like 60 days, they say, and will be given to healthcare workers or people, essential workers, right? So I think that hasn't been talked about enough either, because
Right.
the whole idea is, oh, go ahead. Mhm.
I was going to say, as you mentioned in regard to the anthrax discussion, right? This is the same kind of thing, that this was something that they're just pushing this out to achieve their goals without any real. I want us to remember that the anthrax vaccine, in regard to Robert Cadlick, who's involved with the coronavirus vaccine now, is somebody who knowingly pushed out things that did hurt people. And even as you point out, they even lost a lawsuit with the Pentagon. They lost. Yeah. They were held responsible for knowingly hurting people. These are the ones, and it's just the same thing happening again today. It's like we're banging our heads against a wall trying to wake people up to exactly what's happened before. It's staggering.
Right. Well, that's because this is not about health. I mean, I think that's becoming abundantly clear as this, pandemic, all of this plays out. A lot of the solutions we're being given, they're not about healthcare. I've talked about before how, the DOJ's push for indefinite detention doesn't have to do with coronavirus, and this whole contact tracing system doesn't have to do with coronavirus, because those same solutions were being promoted last year as a way to solve mass shootings, right? So they're just moving along the justification of why we need it based on what's relevant and what people are most afraid of. And a lot of these solutions that are being rolled out now are all part of the same longer term agenda that they've been looking for different reasons to implement, and none of them have stuck. And now, they're basically saying across the board, nothing will go back to normal until there's a vaccine. And if you want your life to be normal again, then you have to receive it. So it's basically, mafia tactics at this point. Like, we've taken what you want, normalcy, and we won't give it back to you until you do what we want, which is have this thing injected into you. Who knows what it will have, because we honestly don't know. And we don't know the long-term effects. It's just a giant experiment.